as transparent as you can be, I think it goes a long way to help kind of make them feel like they were in the room and they understood kind of all of the things that went into the decision so they aren't left guessing.
Yeah. Welcome to the Leadership Initiative, where we explore the art and science of leadership through thought-provoking conversations with experts, thought leaders, and change makers. Whether you're a seasoned leader or just starting out on your leadership journey, this podcast is designed to provide you with the tools and inspiration you need to lead with purpose and make a meaningful difference.
Hello, and welcome to the Fisher Leadership Initiative podcast. Today's guest is Stephanie Revish. Stephanie is currently the Vice President of Financial Planning and Analysis at Target. In this role, she is responsible for partnering across the enterprise to optimize and prioritize over $4 billion in annual capital spend, while also driving growth via strategic market positioning and valuation for Target's overall portfolio of approximately 2,000 stores. Prior to joining Target, Stephanie spent time at Cardinal Health, Henry Schein, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and OCLC. Stephanie participates in a number of leadership efforts focused on the advancement of the Columbus community, mentorship, and diversity in the workplace. Stephanie has also been awarded the 2020 Healthcare Businesswomen's Association Luminary Award, the 2020 National Diversity Council's Top 50 Financial Leaders Award, the Fisher College of Business Project Thrive Alumnus of the Year Award, and is a graduate of Leadership Columbus. Stephanie earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in accounting from The Ohio State University. She lives in Columbus, Ohio, with her husband Jerome and two daughters, Madison and Sydney. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So glad to have you. So we are talking about leadership and decision making today.
Big words.
Yes. We always have questions about decision making. Before we dive into that topic, I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about your role and how you ended up in your role.
Yeah, well, I've spent pretty much my entire career in some area of finance, both on the accounting side and now probably over the last 10 plus years, I lose track of time, partly because I don't want to admit my age, in the financial planning and analysis area with a couple divots or I call off-ramps into pricing and transformation. But for the most part, it's been either accounting or financial planning and analysis. And my current role with Target is one that I started a little over 2 years ago. I was looking for a change from healthcare just to get a different set of experiences because I have a little bit of career left and wanted to shake it up a little bit. So I went more of the retail route when I joined Target and was really excited to go into a role that allowed me, I would say, to focus more on what's in the future versus what's right now. So over half my time is spent thinking about where do we position our investments to really unlock value in the future, both from a growth perspective, from an efficiency perspective. And so it's been really fun to think more strategically and long term. And then on the side, I also do business partnering with some areas within Target, which is a lot of fun as well.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. So you make a lot of decisions.
I mean, sort of. I think I'm in meetings all day centered around some form of decision. So yes, it's just the name of the game.
Well, this will be a very big question then, a very general question, but answer however you choose. Can you describe your decision-making process and also a little bit about how it's either evolved or changed?
Yeah, I would say if I think about my early years, my decision-making, I would say, was very literal, very much quantitative, very much oriented to the task at hand, a lot of times siloed in how I would think about different decisions. And as I gained experience through the course of my career, I really began to appreciate the value of making sure your decision is more holistic. And so adding some elements of qualitative to the mix. And so thinking beyond just the more data-driven aspects of decision making and thinking more about how do you pull in business acumen? How do you pull in industry dynamics? How do you pull in competitive benchmarking? How do you think more broadly from an enterprise mindset perspective? And so I would say my decision making has definitely evolved quite a bit in terms of how I think about implications holistically in the type of inputs that are really necessary to drive the right decision making. Because if you're too siloed, if you're too literal, you can miss a lot of signals in the system that are really important when you're making decisions, big and small. The other thing that I think I realized as I evolved in my career is sometimes you can think about a decision as, what do I know? Or how can I analyze the situation? But a lot of times the power of people and relationships are just as important, because you typically in a big organization can't make a decision in a silo, especially if it is cross-functional, but you also can't get the right support for a decision without the involvement of people. Right. And so that was something I probably took a little more for granted early on, that now it's like front and center in all decision making is thinking about who needs to be involved, who needs to be informed, and who needs to support.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of that balance, just because when I hear you say that, I think your experience probably feeds a lot of how you've come to know how much qualitative, to factor in to your decisions. How do you find that balance between data and the qualitative inputs?
Yeah, it's an interesting balance to strike, because I think that there's a place for both. And I think the signals sometimes from a data standpoint can feel stronger. Whereas for some of the qualitative pieces, it sometimes can be a little murky, a little more uncertain. And so finding the right balance between the types of inputs you need to make the decision and being really honest around where qualitative plays, but also being really honest about how strong of a signal it is, or how perfect of a signal it might be compared to others. And so I think it's what I found is you don't ever want to make a decision with too much emphasis on one. But if you bring a balance between both, you really get a better outcome. But you often have to be a little more uncomfortable with the qualitative than the quantitative, because it's just a little more gray at times, or a little more imperfect. But honestly, I think with the explosion of data, getting clear signals from data is actually, the quantitative side is harder than it's ever been, because you got to figure out what to use, what not to use. You've got to think about the quality of the data that you're using, the cleanliness of it. And so I would say that, quite honestly, like the quantitative feels harder because you have more to choose from. And not harder than the qualitative per se, but just harder than it used to be. Because now you have more signals to decipher through.
Right.
And that's important too.
Yeah, absolutely. All to make life easier, right? We have all this extra information, although sometimes it doesn't quite work out that way.
I know. Well, AI is going to solve everything. So
Of course. Yes, that's a whole other podcast.
It totally is. How to use Gen AI in decision making, part 2.
Yes, absolutely. We will be inviting you back for that, because that sounds compelling. So I'm curious, with high stakes decision making, how does that look? How is that different? And what are the key factors you consider?
Yeah, it's definitely different than an everyday decision. And so a lot of things that I might consider differently when it's a high stakes decision, there's just some kind of fundamental questions I pause and I reflect on longer, because I know that the ramifications are probably a little more complicated. And so I think about things like context. Like, do we even agree and understand the question or the decision that we're trying to answer or solve? Because you would be amazed when we move into the high stakes category, how anxious people get and how emotional sometimes it can become. And if you don't try to make sure we're all aligned on the decision truly, then you can swirl a lot, just because the emotions and the anxiety are probably at a higher level when it's a high stakes decision. So really grounding in the context of, are we all on the same page on the decision we're trying to make? And then reflecting for a moment on do we have precedent? Have we been here before? And if we have, what did we learn from that? Did it go well? Did it not go well? And not because I'm the type of person who likes to rely on the history to predict the present or the future in terms of success, but knowing what we've tried and knowing how it went, if we've have made a run at something before, and being really honest about the variables that were present at that point just helps us to have a little bit of a maybe legs up on how we consider the decision at hand. So precedent, history, experience, those things sometimes help when you're just trying to get to the context and really think about the decision in a balanced way. And so those things are important. And also the context of the industry and market. What are our competitors doing? What are we seeing more broadly? Are we looking to make a decision that puts us in a leadership position, a position to catch up on something? I think the context of the industry and the competitor set sometimes can help too, to just understand, are we playing in the same arena with the same set of variables and maybe potentially the same level of risk? Right. Are we really going out on a limb potentially because we have conviction around something? And so pausing and understanding context is really important. Yeah. And I think once you understand the context, you can start to think about the variables tied to the actual decision, like who might be impacted, what might be the implications if we get it wrong, are those short-term or long-term? Yeah. How quickly could we recover if we don't get it right? And being really honest about those things just helps to understand truly like the ramifications and the risk profile of the decision that we're making so that we can make the best kind of next step. And sometimes when the stakes are high, the best next step is to actually test and learn versus fully scale a decision. And so for me, I prefer when the stakes are really high and there's the risk is really high to test into it a bit more intentionally, to build confidence before we go too far too fast. And so I think there's ways in which you can take the risk, harness it, protect yourself a bit, but still make progress. Right. And that can look a little different too, just to help with the notion of like, what am I putting at risk? Right. And do I have to risk it all? Because ideally, we don't want to be in risk it all territory, right? We want to be in, if it's too risky, let's figure out a way to get a little more confident before we go too far too fast.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that concept of the pause too. And it kind of ties into a lot of what we discuss about emotional intelligence, because there can be a lot of emotions that kind of come into play when the stakes are higher. So thank you for that. What are your thoughts on intuition and decision making?
Yeah, so I'm not gonna lie, I'm gonna totally own this, and then I'm gonna get stereotyped as the typical finance and accounting person.
Okay.
But I, for sure, value data-driven decision making the most. Now, I say that, and I realize that there are limitations to data, right? And so there is a place for intuition, because a lot of times what intuition really is just experience. You've seen some things before, you've got deeper and wider context. And so I like to couple the data-driven with the intuition, but I just prefer to lead with the data. And how I've seen intuition play a really strong role is it might help us like pressure test our assumptions to make sure we're pulling in some of the inputs that are probably necessary or needed, just the fulsome kind of nature of an analysis. And sometimes that intuition can pressure test trends and things that maybe wouldn't be as apparent to someone who's got a limited purview or less experience. And so I think there's a place for intuition, but the best is when you take the intuition with the data and you couple and you kind of have that art and science balance that you use to really drive the right decision. But leading with the data would always be my preference.
Okay.
I'll own it. I get some people will say, "Oh, but I've seen this, I've done this, I know this. Back in 1985, we tried to do that." There's a lot of that.
Yes.
And I respect it, but at times it can get in the way of the realities of right now, and cause us to not look forward as much as we look back to what we think we know. Yeah. In an environment that just moves too fast, and things are changing too much.
And we are definitely moving fast. Yes. Get that objective view is important. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. How do you cultivate alignment around teams when decisions are made at an executive level?
Yeah, that can be hard. There's, as much as I can, I really do prefer an empowered culture where our teams are as involved in the decisions as we are, because they're often the closest to the realities of what's happening. And so when we can empower our teams to help us inform a recommendation to then inform a decision, I think that holds a lot of power. But we all know that that is not the case a lot of times, and decisions have to be made at the highest levels at times. And so when that's the case, I try to be as honest with my team as possible. I try to be transparent about what went into the decision that maybe they wouldn't have purview into, because what I don't want them to perceive is that we made the decision lightheartedly or without considering a number of angles or next best alternatives, those types of things. And now, like that level of transparency can get dicey, right? You can't always tell your team everything. Some things are highly confidential, but as transparent as you can be, I think it goes a long way to help kind of make them feel like they were in the room and they understood kind of all of the things that went into the decision, so they aren't left guessing.
Yeah.
I think that transparency and that communication is extremely important. The other thing that I try to do is give them space, especially my direct reports, when there is something that has to be communicated more tops down, which may catch them off guard or they haven't been involved in. Give them the space to be vulnerable and vent. Because sometimes they just need to express how they're reacting or feeling to something that's been communicated in a safe way.
Yeah.
And so I try to create a space for us to do that, just so that they have the opportunity to move along their change curve. Because sometimes we forget that as a leadership team, we may have been talking about this for 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, months even, beyond that. But our teams are sometimes, they're finding out for the first time. And so even though we've worked through like our change curve relative to whatever the decision is, they're just starting.
Yeah.
And so having some grace for the fact that we're trying to help them catch up to a decision that we've been wrestling with probably for some time is important. But the one thing I always leave with, even in those moments where they're venting, if there is potentially at times an emotional reaction to decision, is I don't expect you to always agree with the decision. You're a human being. We're all more than capable of having different reactions to things, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I do need you to align with the decision.
Right.
I need you to trust the leadership team. I need you to trust me. Because if you don't, the way in which you show up as a team member and a leader will be obvious. And that can become toxic. That can impact the culture of the team. That can impact our ability to move forward past a decision. And so I don't expect my team to agree with everything, but I do ask them to like process and then align. And if they can't align, we have to talk about it, because the ramifications of that are just, they can be more extensive, and we got to move to a point of alignment at some point.
Right. Yeah. That transparency and that communication, being open at every stage. And I love the idea of letting people be human, giving them a little space and then following up with decisions. That's fantastic. This is always a hard one. It comes up in classes a lot, but how do you handle decision making under pressure? And I'm thinking specifically time pressure, like when you don't have the time to have the meetings and the, all the lead up.
Yeah, that's a good one. I the notion of making decisions under pressure just almost feels like table stakes anymore. The reason for the pressure and the timeline, I think, are variables for sure, but it's just the environment lends itself to a lot of pressure anymore. When the timeline is tight, that's an interesting angle, because I think what it typically means is you have to involve less people. And sometimes what I found is when we don't have as much time, you've got to do two things. You've either got to shrink the room and really trust a smaller team to inform a recommendation and a decision, depending on how complex it is. And so getting focused is typically necessary, because the more people involved, the longer it takes, the more consensus and alignment you have to build, and it just slows you down. And so big decisions, I would say, under a tight timeline, shrink the room, get the right couple few, and trust that they're going to help us get to the right decision would be what I would recommend. When it's just an everyday decision and the timeline is tight, it depends on, back to the high stakes piece. Like, it kind of depends. Like, there are decisions that come with a tight timeline, and I know the stakes are extremely low. The timeline never creates pressure for me if it's tight and the stakes are low. Like, I'm like, okay, we can be reasonable. When the stakes are high and the timeline's tight, that's probably a little different.
Yeah.
But I would say there are fire drill moments related to decision making often. And I found that I handle those with ease when the stakes are lower versus when the stakes are higher. And that's probably natural too. So understanding how you really decouple the emotion depending on the risk profile of a decision, I think is one of the biggest tactics. Otherwise, every last minute short timeline decision can start to feel stressful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This is a very interesting question. I'm very curious to hear what you're going to say. And this is, what strategies do you use to stay informed and up to date with industry trends?
Well, back to there's so much information to consume. It's hard to decipher. I do think it's gotten harder and harder to figure out what to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And so even for myself, I am less of a books person now.
Okay.
Because books take a lot of time to read. And so I find I would call microdosing for data and information the best way for me to consume, given the abundance of things out there. And so for me, I try to think about, what do I want pushed to me? Like emails, newsletters, that type of thing. What do I want to have to go get? And I try to use a little bit of a delineation between things that come to me where I just know I can stay informed versus things that I identify that I like, that I know I need to create the discipline to go check out or pulse in on. But if it has an executive summary, if it's got the headlines, those are my favorite, because I feel like I can get enough to know whether I should go deeper or like, oh, that's interesting, but I don't, that's not relevant for me right now and I don't have the time. So I prefer the things that are micro with executive summaries that can help steer me toward going deeper or not. And I like to use consultant newsletters and publications. I like to use analyst reports. I like to listen to podcasts, things that I can kind of consume while I'm out on a walk so I can leverage my time strategically. And every once in a while, a formal like consultant engagement to flesh something out in a deeper way. Sometimes it calls for a little bit of a strategy like that. I also had a mentee of mine introduced me to the Headway app. I don't know if you've seen the Headway app.
I don't know that one.
It takes books and it creates like a very succinct summary in let's call it 10-ish pages. So I call it takes out the fluff of the stories and the examples, and it gives you like the nuggets.
Right.
And I've actually, that's led me back to a little different approach around books too that I've found helpful.
Great. The Headway app.
Yeah.
Do you have any other recommendations in terms of podcasts or anything that, supports you and supplies you with information?
So I will be honest, I rely on my newsletters and things like that for the more technical, what's going on in the industry, what's going on in the market. I use my podcasts for a little bit of my leadership, personal, human type of needs. Just so I like a Adam Grant or a Brene Brown. So even Oprah. So I try to find the podcasts that help me to think differently about leadership, help me to think differently about team, culture, human connection, those types of things to just balance out. Like the way I'm wired, my day job is extremely technical. I try to stay in touch with a lot of things that are happening in the market and industry that are technical. I need something to balance it all out.
Yes.
Something to help me be a better leader and a human is kind of how I use my podcast moments.
Yeah, those are some great podcasts too. Yeah, we listen to Adam Grant quite a bit at FLI.
Well, then I have like the Apple Podcast notification for certain topics where it'll just push something to me and say, are you interested in this? Or you might be interested in this. So I try to use that to challenge me to consume podcasts I might not otherwise consume, like on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. The information coming at us, so much good too, right?
Totally. Well, it is. It's like you've got to pick and choose what you consume because you just can't consume it all.
No.
Mm-mm. And that has become harder. I remember it used to be like you get a magazine in the mail. Or you go to official training and development. Like there were very few mechanisms because we weren't as digital as we are now.
Right.
And in some ways it limited us, but in some ways it was easier.
Yeah.
To decipher what to pay attention to.
It's true. Now we have to practice active decision-making skills all the time.
Yes, on what to consume, what not to consume, what to pay attention to, what to ignore.
Yes.
You are very much on in ways you don't realize, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in terms of culture, circling back to teams, how do you foster a culture of effective decision making?
Well, and I cannot shortchange at all the power of team when it comes to decision making, especially as a leader. I think first and foremost, having a diverse and inclusive team is just the foundation. Because when you bring a diverse set of people together who have a variety of experiences, a variety of backgrounds, a variety of perspectives, you get the goodness of all of that.
Yeah.
And then when you create an inclusive environment, you create the safety that's needed to have the transparent and vulnerable conversations and honestly debates, because a lot of decisions require debates and sharing of differing opinions that then move you closer to an aligned point of view or a recommendation. But starting first and foremost with that diverse and inclusive team, I think is the foundation of it. I've also really always loved collaboration. And so one of the things that I always emphasize with my team is like pull in the best of everyone, because there's very few decisions where we have the best information, the best experience. We're functional in nature. We've built business acumen. We've built industry acumen, but we've got partners for a reason. And so collaborating across to build in the perspective of a wide enough group to help us make decision making is something I always emphasize with my team. But the watch out with that is you've got to be careful you're not creating bureaucracy, you're not creating consensus building or groupthink. And so collaborating for the sake of something that's better for the enterprise is really the outcome, versus just collaborating to make everyone feel like they're part of a decision, which can be dangerous. But I think that collaboration approach and that relational approach to decision making can be really powerful. And then the third thing that we always talk about is just the ability to try to be transparent on what we're trying to learn. Because a lot of the decisions we're making, we're using a set of assumptions. We're not going to be right either way. Like something will not be perfect. So we've got a set of assumptions we're using to make and inform a decision. And part of how we get comfortable moving forward is knowing that we can course correct, we can pivot if needed. And so using our learning approach to hold ourselves accountable to a set of assumptions, monitor what we're actually seeing, and then being honest about, all right, is this good or do we need to pivot is really critical in just helping to build confidence around decisions. But I think also the accountability it creates.
Yeah.
Because the quality of our decisions we can only feel so comfortable with if we feel like our decisions are quality. And we don't know if they are until we actually hold ourselves accountable to what we say we base the decision on.
Yeah.
And so I think those are 2 or 3 things that I think are important within a team.
Right.
And something that with my team is always top of mind.
I want to go back to what you were saying about debates and healthy debates. And I'm just curious, what does that look like for you? A healthy debate, is there a certain sort of parameter you can put around that?
Well, I'm Midwest, so you already know it involves being nice to each other. But I fundamentally believe we should be able, again, if we have the right environment and the right culture, we should be able to have open conversations about how we're thinking about things.
Right.
Even when we're not on the same page, that doesn't feel personal. That doesn't feel like an attack. It doesn't feel like someone's smarter than the other person or better than the other person. And so for me, it's just having the environment that allows for us to have the honest conversation, the transparent conversation, and not leave with our feelings hurt.
Right.
But just leave feeling like, man, I'm glad they trusted me enough to actually share how they felt. But I'm glad they were also open-minded enough for us to get to maybe something in the middle of what we were both thinking, or something in the middle of what we were all thinking. And so being able to do it respectfully and from a place of relationship, so that it's not personal and there's not, I would call, residue that lingers after we get out of the meeting or the moment.
Yeah.
Those are the things that I always hope for. They don't always happen, but those are the things that when that happens, I think we're really in a special place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It seems like that's the place of innovative thinking, and that's how we come to some of the best answers. Stephanie, is there anything that we haven't discussed that you would like to discuss around decision making or leadership in general?
We've covered a lot of ground. And I always say this is the world according to Stephanie and nobody only. So take what is helpful and throw away the rest. I will not be offended. Don't tell me to my face at any point if you see me. But I think there's power in us just sharing our perspectives and experiences.
Yes.
And hopefully we can all grow from pieces and parts, and at times feel comfort knowing we're not alone, that there's other people who are experiencing decision-making, maybe with similar thoughts or experiences. The couple things that I might just emphasize is that decision-making is still very much a place of vulnerability as a leader. And you're often making decisions or trying to help drive decisions with the best information you have available. And sometimes it's not going to go right. You're not going to get it right. And just reminding anyone who's earlier in their career or maybe newer to leadership that is completely to be expected. And there is no such thing as a perfect leader or perfect decision maker. We all get it wrong sometimes. And what's most important is how you learn from getting it wrong, how you course correct and pivot, how you own it at times with your peers and with your team. But give yourself some grace.
Right.
Because there will be some moments where you feel like you just blew your whole career up because you made the wrong call. And there should be very few decisions in your career that are really at that level. So keeping it in perspective, showing yourself some grace, and knowing that there's not a leader who hasn't misstepped or made a bad decision, not from a place of malintent or just from a place of trying to make the best call with the best information. You're not alone in that. And learning and growing and becoming stronger through it is half the battle too. Because there'll be more times that come and come again and continue. So
that is a great final message. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and we will call you back about that AI conversation.
Yes, more to come, more to learn for sure. But it is the hot topic that will not go away.
It is. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening. This podcast is presented by the Max M. Fisher College of Business at The Ohio State University. For more episodes, find us on Apple, Google, or podcast.osu.edu/leadership initiative. See you next time.